Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you for your patience. And by the way, as Michael said as well, to the staff, the amazing staff here at Whistler Plateau, thank you for a lovely lunch. It was great as always. Yeah. I have a slideshow accompanying my remarks. I've often found that politicians at front of rooms without audiovisual aids can often be a dry prospect, especially after each of you I know have had a long and busy week. So I have a slideshow to go along with my talk today. So I appreciate your patience in sitting through lunch and for welcoming me here to talk to you about a really interesting time in Canada's history and what's going on in the federal parliament. But I'd be remiss if I didn't begin my comments by first of all congratulating the Chamber of Commerce. 2 weeks ago, I spoke at the Vancouver Board of Trade. And I know that the Vancouver Board of Trade, under the leadership of Ian Black, is undergoing a great deal of renewal, and it's fantastic for that organization. And I know that the Tri-Cities Chamber of Commerce has filled an incredibly important role in one of the fastest growing communities in the fastest growing province of the most successful country in the G7 right now. So the Tri-Cities Chamber of Commerce and the kind of events that you do, bringing people together to talk about public policy, to talk about the successes and failures of governments and local, municipal, and federal, local, provincial, and federal governments, how we can get things right. And generating that kind of discussion is really critical because this is ground zero of the conversation about the next generation of Canada's economic growth. So thank you all for inviting me here today to discuss with you a little bit about where we're going. And by the way, with regard to the Tri-Cities Chamber of Commerce in your renewal, to the board and to the staff of the Chamber of Commerce, I would be, very proud to stand here and congratulate you on the hiring of Jillian. Jillian, over here, yes. I know Jillian has only been with the Chamber of Commerce for a very short while, but her, as you know, across the Tri-Cities is incredibly well known for her energy, hard work, passion for the Tri-Cities, and the energy that she's brought to the Chamber of Commerce is invaluable. And I know that the Chamber will be built on the kind of professionalism, energy, and great work that Jillian has put forward so far, and will serve the Chamber of Commerce and the broader community for many years to come. So congratulations, Jillian, and to the Chamber of Commerce. So. So now, I want to talk about what is the dominant issue in the country right now, and indeed around the world, and that is the state of the economy. And for context, it's useful just to take a moment and consider where we've come from. It was just over 3 years ago that the world economy was in very dire straits. At a critical juncture in reacting to the crisis in the G7 finance ministers and central bank governors met in Washington, D.C. at one of the real crisis moments, probably the biggest economic crisis moment that the world has seen economically since the end of the Second World War and the beginning of Reconstruction. And on Friday, October 10th, 2008, they got together to discuss what are we going to do about this and what's next. They created a 5-point plan across all the governments, a 5-point plan that was quite critical at that time. As many of you will remember, Lehman Brothers had failed just a month before, and Bear Stearns had failed just prior to that. Some German regional banks had fallen apart, and there were bank failures in the United Kingdom, and it wasn't clear that the equity markets were even going to be opening the following day. This was DEFCON 5 of economic crisis. The plan that they agreed to that day restored a degree of direction and confidence to the global economy. In November of 2008, a month later, the G20, which is about 80% of the world's GDP, made a decision that we would go ahead with stimulus in our respective economies to try to protect our citizens from the worst of the global recession. 4% of GDP. 4% is what was agreed to across all the countries of stimulus spending to inject cash into the economy to make sure that we had that growth. Moving forward from there in Canada, our domestic plan was called the Economic Action Plan. It was a plan to deliver stimulus in the Canadian economy with cooperation, and this was critical, with the cooperation of Canada's provinces and municipal governments to deliver the stimulus to protect Canadians from the worst of the economic downturn. For British Columbians, we saw more investment in British Columbia priority projects, more money coming to the province of British Columbia than at any other time before in Canadian history. We worked closely with then Premier Campbell and then Infrastructure Minister Kevin Falcon to identify the key projects for the province of British Columbia and ensure that the money came forward for BC and that we got projects done. And we invested in projects all across the province. And this was critical for us in the Economic Action Plan, was that not only was it important to have this 4% of stimulus in the economy, but we wanted to make sure that the money was invested in the economy across the country, fairly across the country. One of the reasons I first got involved in politics was a passion and a sense of injustice that I had, that certain parts of the country were not treated fairly. But we wanted to make sure that all Canadians were treated fairly with regard to the stimulus spending, and to make sure that the entire country moved forward. And even within the province of British Columbia, we wanted to make sure that stimulus spending and economic spending was fairly distributed around the province of British Columbia. So we invested in projects all across BC. Projects like the new Park Bridge in Kicking Horse Canyon. Projects like our support for the widening and rebuilding of the Sea to Sky Highway just prior to the 2010 Olympic and Paralympic Games. The expansion, resurfacing, and rebuilding of Highway 97 all across the province of British Columbia. Long overdue, a critical artery for British Columbia's success. We invested in improvements in Highway 3 in the southern interior of British Columbia, and many other projects all across BC. We also installed and rebuilt water and sewage systems in cities and towns all across BC. And of course, we followed through on the completion of the Canada Line and its station improvements, one of the most successful rapid transit projects in the history of the country. As well, we have made our full financial commitment to the Evergreen SkyTrain extension here to the Tri-Cities, a project that will, yes. This is a project that will reshape the quality of life of Tri-City residents, give us more opportunities and options in how we want to commute within the Tri-Cities and beyond. And as well, we have also invested, by the way, in universities and colleges all across the province of BC. Simon Fraser University's Burnaby and Surrey campuses have been expanded and improved. The University of Northern British Columbia up in Prince George, where I'm from, go Timberwolves. The UNBC's campus has been expanded with their new labs and the expansion of their medical school up there. The Northern Lights College in Dawson Creek has expanded their campus and training center. We also supported the expansion of airports all across BC. I mean, airports are really critical to communities all across our province. So we supported expansion of airport facilities in Kamloops and Cranbrook and Prince George, all across the province. We supported terminal upgrades for BC ferries, including the busiest one down in Tawasin. We supported the Port of Prince Rupert's expansion and upgrades for their modernization. And it's not just our large ports for economic commerce that we invested in to ensure that British Columbia's economy moves forward. We also have been protecting and improving and expanding our smaller ports and places as well, places like Steveston and the waterfront there, which is so important to the identity of the community down there. And we've also built a new cruise ship terminal in Nanaimo for the cruise ship season to try to get more of those dollars from tourists onto central Vancouver Island. And we also invested into BC's cultural and social infrastructure, and as Minister of Canadian Heritage, I'm very proud of this as well. So we invest in projects like the expansion of the Vancouver Aquarium, a new center stage for the popular and successful Bard on the Beach, a newly renovated and expanded Science World, the site protection and program expansion up at Barkerville, just outside, not just outside, 3 hours outside of Quesnel. We protected great heritage buildings around the province as well, like the Laurel Packing House in the Cultural District in downtown Kelowna. We renovated, and what we also did is we looked for opportunities for cultural investment. And for example, up in Dawson Creek, we have now the Calvin Crux Centre for the Arts, the largest multidisciplinary arts and cultural facility in northern British Columbia. And at this point, I would just assure you this is the before picture. It looks much nicer since this picture was taken. We also invested in the Royal BC Museum over in Victoria, and as well as renovations at the Queen Elizabeth Theatre. And we also invested in parks and green spaces. We invested $1 million into Rocky Point Park here in Port Moody, but we also invested into many of our national and regional parks like the Pacific Rim National Park that is seen here. We did all this, of course, to invest in the local economy, but also to protect BC's cultural spaces for generations to come. And as the Member of Parliament for the Tri-Cities, we were also able to advance projects that are key to the quality of life of my constituents and to our community. Projects like the new track, roof, and renovations at Percy Perry Stadium in Coquitlam, the completion of social housing projects like the New View Society in downtown and the south side of Port Coquitlam, We also completed the new Pitt River Bridge, which was a critical piece of infrastructure, not only for its own sake, but also because the way in which it was designed. As many of you will know, this will has helped ease traffic of those who are commuting up the Fraser Valley, up the north side, up to Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge, and Mission. But more importantly, for those of us who live and commute and operate within the Tri-Cities, for traffic that's coming westbound from Pitt Meadows, Maple Ridge, and Mission, it steers that traffic southward towards the Maryhill bypass and then onto the number 1 highway, and then obviously future towards the expanded and twin Port Mann Bridge. Again, taking traffic from the valley away from the Tri-Cities, easing the congestion on our local roads. We also funded and repaired local roads around the Tri-Cities, like the refurbishment and rebuilding of East Road in Anmore. And also we supported a number of road projects within the Tri-Cities that were really critical and identified by the cities of Port Moody, Coquitlam, and Port Coquitlam, like the Lougheed Highway expansion, the completion of the Broadway connector, which really completed the vision that the city of Port Coquitlam had, which was to connect north and south across the Coast Meridian overpass, but actually to connect it down then to the Maryhill bypass and then onwards towards Highway 1. And also we supported a project near to my heart, the Nunes Creek Bridge replacement in Port Moody. Taken all together, all across the province, all across the country, and across the Tri-Cities. As I said, these projects, large and small, whether they were museums and galleries and parks, roads, bridges and tunnels, public transit, overpasses, ports, airports, all taken together, it has been the largest investment in infrastructure in Canada's history, in the Tri-Cities, in British Columbia, and indeed in Canada. And as a result today, Canada has recovered all of the output that we lost, all of it, that we lost in the recession of 2008 and 2009. There are over 600,000 more Canadians working today than were working at the time of the recession. That's unprecedented to have that kind of turnaround in that short a period of time. Close to 90% of those jobs, by the way, have been created since July 2009, and more than 90% of them are full-time jobs, well-paying jobs in growth industries for the future. When measured against the same basis in the United States, our unemployment rate is about 2.5 percentage points lower than that of the United States. This gap in Canada's favor is something that hasn't been seen in Canada, that has not been seen for over a generation. And this didn't just happen by accident. When we were first elected into government in January of 2006, it was widely talked about and widely known that the United States housing bubble was on the brink and that there were some serious troubles. So when we were first elected as a government, we, in good times, paid down our bills. We had the largest single debt pay down in Canadian history. And we also lower taxes across the board. We lower taxes in every way that the federal government collects them. Small business taxes, corporate taxes, consumption taxes, reducing the GST by 2 points, and income taxes. And in fact, the federal income tax burden today is at its lowest point that it has been since 1968. We paid down Canada's debt when times were good. In fact, as I said, we made the largest debt pay down in history. And we did all this at a time when opposition parties and many in the media thought that we had endless surpluses on the horizon and we should increase government spending, increase the government's liability, and grow the size of government and have no worry for tomorrow. They were wrong, and history, I think, has proven our prudent course right. We also reduced red tape, and we continue to promote free trade. We continue to promote trade because we have to. And we also want to reduce tariffs and sign more free trade agreements. And at the risk of sounding immodest on this front, I would like to very proudly proclaim something, that our government is the most pro-free trade, pro-international commerce government that Canada has ever seen. In fact, since we formed government 6 years ago, our government has launched an ambitious free trade plan, increasing opportunities for Canadian workers and businesses by concluding and signing new free trade agreements with 8 countries: Colombia, Jordan, Panama, Peru, the European Free Trade Association member states of Iceland, Liechtenstein, Norway, and Switzerland. And 2 weeks ago, Canada and China signed a Foreign Investment Protection Agreement, a pact that will set the stage for a significant increase in two-way trade between Canada and China. Negotiations are also well underway with the European Union and India, which taken together would boost the Canadian economy by at least, it is very modest, by at least $18 billion a year. Put that in perspective, $18 billion per year with those 2 free trade agreements in the early stages, and those agreements only grow as there's greater economic integration. $18 billion. The government of British Columbia every year spends $45 billion. So those 2 trade agreements would have massive economic consequence and benefit for all Canadians. Added to these agreements, I would also point out that since we formed government in 2006, we have successfully negotiated new open sky agreements or updated or liberalized our air agreements with Mexico, Costa Rica, Brazil, Qatar, Algeria, Egypt, Jamaica, Trinidad and Tobago, Switzerland, El Salvador, Tunisia, Ethiopia, Morocco, Cuba, the European Union entirely, South Africa, New Zealand, South Korea, Japan, Turkey, the Dominican Republic, Panama, the Philippines, Barbados, Mexico, Singapore, Iceland, Jordan, Kuwait, Ireland, the United States, Croatia, and Serbia. We have had a very busy agenda on the international scene. In fact, we have concluded bilateral air agreements with 86 foreign countries and territories, including all 27 European Union member states, and we are considering air agreements and negotiations with other countries in almost every continent in the world. And again, we achieved all this at a time when we were in a minority situation in Parliament and when the forces of protectionism and isolationism and fear were saying, close the borders, stay home, don't expand internationally. But they were wrong. And through these actions over time, our government has, again, first, early debt paid down when we had the money to do so. Second, unprecedented tax relief across the Canadian economy to pursue and to spur economic activity. And third, unprecedented investment in infrastructure across the country and in the Canadian economy through our stimulus plan when times were needed. So we have arrived at an economy that is, frankly, very much the envy of the world, and the world is indeed noticing this. For the fourth year in a row, the World Economic Forum rates our banking system as the world's soundest. 5 Canadian financial institutions were named on Bloomberg's list of the world's strongest banks, more than any other country in the world. Both the IMF and the OECD forecast that we will have among the strongest economic growth in the G7 in the years ahead. And Forbes magazine has ranked Canada #1 in its annual look at the best countries in the world in which to do business. And recently, 3 credit ratings agencies, Moody's, Fitch, and Standard & Poor's, affirmed their top ratings for Canada. And this is all very good, but we are not immune to the challenges that emanate from beyond our borders. And again today, we are staring a new crisis in the face, one about which we have to be very serious and prudent. The most immediate issue, of course, is in Europe, where concrete actions are still clearly needed to deal with the sovereign debt and banking crises that are facing those economies. Even with this week's austerity actions that were approved in Greece, Europe still is very much in trouble, and we need to be very mindful and responsible of the way in which we react to that. Recently, Prime Minister Harper made the case for more responsible and aggressive action to deal with the continuing problem of this global economy and the crises that we face. And our government is moving forward and taking action, controlling what we can control, and taking action at home so that we can best prepare the Canadian economy for what may be tough times ahead. And as I said, in good times of surplus, we paid down our debt, and as a result, in bad times and crisis, we had the room to respond when we needed to. And because we paid down those amounts of debt, we were able to keep our net debt to GDP ratio well below our G7 counterparts, while other nations were piling on vast amounts of new debt and on top of old debt. In fact, the IMF is projecting that Canada's net debt to GDP ratio will be at 34.9%. And that's all of the governments of Canada, federal and provincial, all of them combined. The national net debt to GDP ratio is 34.9%. The province of British Columbia, by the way, is at 18%. The province of Quebec, by the way, is at 51%. And the province of Ontario, if many of you saw the Drummond report earlier this week, is facing some very difficult choices of their own. In contrast, Germany is projected to be at 57.2%. The United States at 72.6%, the United Kingdom at 72.9%, France at 81%, and Italy is over 100%. The G7 average net debt to GDP ratio for this year is 80%, and again, Canada, 34.9%. So I'd like to say a few words about Canada's strengths and where we are going in this Parliament and how we plan to make sure that Canada maintains our economic advantage. We will use flexibility if we need to going forward to keep our economy strong. If we have to do so, we will do so. But we must always remember that we will only hold on to our economic advantage by continuing to be disciplined and to pursue those strategies that have made us so resilient in the very first place. Responsibility, discipline, determination, saying no to new, cute, fancy, expensive ideas, and making sure that we face down the repeated calls from some who want to betray those cornerstone principles that have stood Canada so well on the global stage. Our balanced approach has, I think, served this country indeed very well. We are reining in spending, and we're also eliminating the deficit in the medium term in a responsible and manageable way. Because balanced budgets are not great goals and ends in and of themselves. For their own sake, they mean nothing. But balanced budgets are important because of what they allow the economy to do and the kind of flexibility that they allow the government to do. Reducing debt frees up tax dollars that will otherwise be absorbed by interest costs. This can be reinvested in things that matter to Canadians: healthcare services, public services, lower taxes, debt payment, and investments in our kids. It keeps interest rates low, which is critical for us in British Columbia with the over-leveraging that we have in our real estate markets. It keeps interest rates low, which also will help encourage businesses to create jobs and invest in the future. So to give a snapshot of some of the initiatives that we have launched as a government since we were elected in May of last year, and we will be pursuing these things in order to keep Canada's economic house in order. Recently, we committed to long-term, unprecedented, stable funding for Canada's healthcare system. We are extending the 2004 to 2014 Health Accord by 2 years, which is a 6% per year escalator in healthcare funding from Ottawa. And thereafter, we are going to be locking in a formula that will guarantee increased healthcare spending by the federal government to the provinces going forward. This is what provinces have been asking for: steady, stable funding from the federal government, no cuts, so that provinces can manage their responsibility to deliver the health care that Canadians have come to expect. This is what they've asked for, and this is what we've delivered. Last month in Washington, D.C., we also signed a 2-year extension to the Canada-U.S. Softwood Lumber Agreement, which is a critical agreement, as you know, for British Columbia's largest and most important industry. On infrastructure, in our most recent budget, we made unprecedented funding for local infrastructure permanent by transferring gas tax dollars collected back to municipal governments for their local needs and priorities. For years, this has been the top budgetary ask, the number one hope of the Federation of Canadian Municipalities and the Union of BC Municipalities. Every single year that I've been a member of Parliament, going on 12 years now, every year, these two organizations that represent municipal governments across the country have come to Ottawa and saying this is their number one hope. We listened to them and we delivered in the last budget, and now municipal governments will have a steady, new, stable source of funding for their local needs. This year as well, we, just before Christmas, successfully concluded the largest government procurement in Canadian history. $33 billion investment into Canada's shipbuilding industry. This $33 billion investment into the Canadian economy has been praised for its objectivity, sound management, and in the long term will be seen as a boost to the Canadian economy at a critical time in our recovery. British Columbia will see thousands of direct and indirect high-paying jobs as a result of Seaspan's successful bid for their shipbuilding contract, and the investment of over $8 billion into BC's economy will benefit all of us, particularly those of us here in the Lower Mainland, because this is where Seaspan is principally based. Also, to support the continued expansion of Canada's digital economy, we are pushing ahead with our Copyright Modernization Act, legislation that will give Canada a modern intellectual property rights regime that will in fact be leading the world in terms of protecting the rights of consumers and creators in the digital era. On top of this, Natural Resource Minister Joe Oliver has recently announced his intentions to move forward with the modernization of Canada's environmental review and approval process to protect our environment, while at the same time ensuring economic growth and investment into our economy. This has long been a grievance of Western premiers, whether they were NDP or Conservative or Liberal, doesn't matter. Western provinces have always complained that Ottawa didn't listen and didn't consult with Western provinces about the need to properly manage our resources and to move forward in a responsible environmental and economic way. Premier Clark has asked for this engagement. Premier Wall of Saskatchewan, Premier Redford of Alberta have all said this is what they want to have happen, and it will benefit Western Canada for many years to come. On the trade liberalization front, with the successful conclusion of the Canada-EU Free Trade Agreement that I described, Canada will stand alone. We will stand alone as being the only country in the world with a comprehensive trade liberalization deal with the United States and also with the European Union, the two largest economies in the world. Once a reality, this will give Canada a tremendous economic advantage on the global scene, but we can't stop there, and we're not going to stop there because we have to go further. Prime Minister Harper recently concluded a very successful week-long visit to China with our Ministers of Trade, Finance, Industry, Agriculture, and Foreign Affairs to pursue greater economic opportunities with China. Our government has had more ministerial visits to China than any government before in Canadian history. And thanks to this persistent and personal engagement, we have witnessed a dramatic growth in Canada's trade relationship with China, where exports from Canada to China have grown 69.6% over the past half-decade. And China is now Canada's second largest merchandise trading partner and our third largest export market. And last year, for British Columbians, this is critical. And last year, for the first time in British Columbia's history, we sold more of our products to China than we did to the United States. And we are the first province to have that reality, but there will be many more that will follow us. So British Columbia's wood exports to China have grown, in fact, from $23 million in 2001 to $794 million in 2010. We exported a record 4.5 million cubic meters of softwood products to China in 2010, up 76% from the year prior. And this growth is going to continue to grow and surge. As a matter of fact, in June of last year, we saw a record-breaking month for BC softwood exports to China, with over 824,000 cubic meters exported, which is up 183.6% over the year prior. Trade with other Asian countries, including India and South Korea, is also on the rise. Trade between India and Canada is up 73% since 2004, with exports increasing over 140% over the same period. As positive and encouraging as these trends are, we know that we must do more. You know, from the Hudson Bay Company through FTA, NAFTA, now the European Trade Agreement and the Asia-Pacific Gateway, Canada always has been and we always will be a trading nation. We believe in creating Canadian jobs through world sales and engaging the world aggressively and persistently and responsibly in Canada's interests. And we will continue down that path in this Parliament. And with the largest port in Canada right here in Vancouver, British Columbia and Vancouver and the Lower Mainland stand to benefit immensely from these growing trade opportunities. So as you can see, ladies and gentlemen, our government has a very aggressive agenda. I think when I last spoke to you, I was bemoaning the fact that we were having the threat of another election because of persistent minority parliaments. And we asked Canadians time and again over the past couple of years, give us a majority government and we will make use of it. Give us a majority government and we will represent Canada proudly internationally. Give us a majority government and we will use it responsibly. Give us a majority government, we will deliver for the Tri-Cities. Give us a majority government, we will deliver for BC. Give us a majority government and we will do you proud. We have delivered in the past, we are delivering now. Canada has never shone more brightly on the international stage than we are today. And under the leadership of Prime Minister Stephen Harper, your continued support, and the agenda that we've put forward, Canada will continue to lead the world very proudly for generations to come. Thank you.